A racist white lawyer insults a black woman in a parking lot outside the courthouse, thinking she is insignificant. However, he quickly receives his comeuppance when he steps into the courtroom and realizes she is the opposing counsel. Nina Johnson drove her silver sedan into the courthouse parking lot, her mind completely focused on the important trial ahead. It was a scorching day, the harsh noon sun glaring down on the asphalt, making the air shimmer with heat. She turned on her signal, preparing to take an empty spot near the courthouse entrance, feeling lucky to have found such a good parking space during such a busy time. Suddenly, a sleek black SUV came speeding from the other side, swerving around the corner without warning. The screech of brakes filled the air as the SUV cut her off, stealing the parking spot she had been about to take. Nina slammed on her brakes, her heart racing from the near collision. For a moment, anger surged through her, but she quickly tried to rein it in. This wasn't the first time she had encountered such arrogance and irresponsibility. The SUV parked crookedly, taking up not one but two parking spaces, as if the driver had no regard for anyone else. Nina took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel for a few seconds, deciding whether or not to confront the driver. Before she could act, the SUV's door opened and a tall man stepped out. He was dressed in an expensive navy blue suit, his tie neatly tightened and sunglasses perched on his head as a symbol of arrogant confidence. His entire demeanor radiated self-importance, as if he were the only person entitled to use this parking lot. The man, Jackson Ford, cast a sharp glance at Nina before approaching her car, his voice cold and accusatory. "Hey, do you realize you almost hit my car?" Jackson said, his tone filled with blame, as if it were entirely Nina's fault. Nina's eyes widened, surprised by his brazenness. She rolled down her window slightly, looking up with a calm expression, though she couldn't completely hide her frustration. "Excuse me?" she asked, hardly believing what she'd just heard. Jackson stopped next to her window, his face twisted in annoyance. "You almost hit my car. You need to be more careful," he said, crossing his arms, his posture demanding submission from her. Nina kept her voice steady but firm. "I had signaled for that parking space. You cut me off." He tilted his head, looking at her with mock amusement, as if her words held no weight. "Oh, really?" Jackson sneered, glancing at his SUV, and then back at Nina's sedan with disdain in his eyes. "Maybe you should have been quicker, but it doesn't matter now, does it? You can find another spot." Jackson's tone was condescending, as though he were talking to a child, completely dismissing Nina and what she had just said. Anger flared in Nina's chest. She was used to encounters like this, where others treated her as an outsider simply because of her skin color or appearance. She took a deep breath, refusing to be drawn into Jackson's insults and prejudice. "That spot was mine," she said, still calm but resolute. "You cut me off and almost caused an accident." Jackson burst out laughing, the sound laced with sarcasm and scorn. He leaned down, resting one hand on the roof of her car, his eyes blazing with challenge. "An accident? You can't be serious. I know how to drive. Maybe you're the one who needs to be more careful." Nina felt a knot tighten in her chest. She'd encountered men like Jackson before, men who believed they were above her and naturally entitled to look down on her, but she wasn't about to let Jackson ruin her day. She took another deep breath, then responded lightly but sharply. "You don't know anything about me," Nina said, her eyes locking with Jackson's. Jackson raised an eyebrow and chuckled derisively. "Oh, I think I know more than you think. People like you, they don't usually drive cars like that unless they're renting or got lucky in the lottery." Nina felt Jackson's words slice through her, filled with malice and racism. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, struggling to stay calm. This was no longer about a parking spot. It was about people like Jackson, who thought they knew everything based on the surface of her life. "I'd advise you to be careful," she said quietly but with conviction. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Jackson's smug smile faltered for a brief second, but he quickly recovered his arrogant composure. "Oh, is that so? Good luck." He tapped twice on the roof of Nina's car with a condescending smirk before turning his back and walking toward his SUV, clearly unconcerned with the interaction they'd just had. Nina sat in her car gripping the steering wheel, trying to suppress the anger rising within her. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and reminded herself that Jackson wasn't worth her time. She had a trial to focus on, and someone like Jackson wouldn't distract her from her mission. Nina closed her eyes and took a deep breath, reminding herself that Jackson wasn't worth her time. She had a trial to focus on, and she wouldn't let someone like him throw her off track. Resolutely shaking off the anger from the encounter, she turned off her car, stepped out, straightened her jacket, and firmly grasped her briefcase. She walked with purpose toward the courthouse, her mind now entirely focused on the important case she was about to face. Everything had to be perfect. The courthouse buzzed with people coming and going, lawyers consulting with their clients, court clerks busy preparing for upcoming trials. Nina maintained her poise, her back straight, and her head held high, reminding herself that she absolutely belonged here. This was where she had fought to stand. The courtroom, where every step had to be sure, and every word had to carry weight. She entered the cool air-conditioned courtroom, immediately feeling the heat from outside dissipate. Her eyes scanned the familiar room, her table, the judge's bench, the court clerks busy with stacks of papers. She placed her briefcase on her desk and began organizing her notes. Her client hadn't arrived yet, but Nina wanted to ensure everything was neatly arranged. This was a big case, and she had to be ready for anything. As she reviewed the key points she would present during the trial, the courtroom door suddenly opened, and the sound of footsteps echoed in the quiet room. Nina looked up, and her eyes immediately landed on the person who had just entered. Her heart sank for a brief moment, but she quickly regained her composure. Jackson Ford, the man from the parking lot, walked into the courtroom with his usual smug expression. His posture still exuded confidence, his shoulders held high, and his gaze swept across the room as though he were the center of attention. But when Jackson turned and looked across the room, his eyes met Nina's, and for a few seconds his confidence faltered. Jackson's eyes widened briefly, his face betraying surprise as he realized that Nina, the woman he had so casually dismissed in the parking lot, was the lead opposing counsel in this trial. In that fleeting moment, Nina saw the change in Jackson's face. He froze as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. But within seconds, Jackson recovered his usual self-assured demeanor, walking in with a composed air, avoiding Nina's gaze. Still, Nina knew the shock had rattled him. He hadn't expected this, and that surprise had cracked his wall of arrogance. Jackson quickly moved to his table, adjusting his shirt collar and briefcase. Though he tried to cover it up, Nina could sense a slight tension in his face. He avoided looking directly at her, but couldn't help sneaking nervous glances in her direction. It was clear that Jackson was struggling to maintain his calm and control, but Nina knew that the shock of seeing her here, in the position of his opponent, had thrown him off balance. Nina smiled inwardly, though her face remained professional and serious. She wouldn't allow herself to show any satisfaction or smugness. She knew that in the courtroom, all that mattered was staying focused on the task at hand. And today, she wasn't going to let personal emotions interfere with this trial. Jackson began arranging his documents, but Nina noticed that he was moving with a touch of awkwardness. He tried to keep everything under control, but his overly meticulous actions, adjusting his tie or tapping his fingers on the table, betrayed his nervousness. Nina continued to glance at him discreetly. Clearly, Jackson hadn't expected his opponent today to be the woman he had insulted in the parking lot. His smugness from that encounter had now been replaced with unease and uncertainty. Nina could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere. Jackson, who had entered with unshakable confidence, was now visibly unsettled. She knew she had gained a psychological advantage, but that wasn't the most important thing. What mattered was that she had thoroughly prepared for this case, and she wouldn't let anything, even Jackson, disrupt her plan. When the judge entered the room and the trial officially began, Nina sat up straight, her eyes focused on every word spoken. She felt her confidence rise, knowing she was ready for the battle ahead. And no matter what Jackson thought, he had already realized that he had misjudged her from the start, not just her legal abilities, but her strength in overcoming prejudice and arrogance. Nina quietly organized her papers in front of her. The real battle was just beginning, and she wasn't about to give Jackson any chance to turn the tables. The trial opened with a tense and formal atmosphere. Every word, every gesture carried the weight of an unforgiving legal confrontation. Jackson was the first to present his opening statement. He stood up, adjusted his suit, and walked toward the jury, trying to regain his usual confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Jackson began, his voice echoing across the courtroom. "My client has been wrongfully accused. We will prove that this is all a misunderstanding and that no wrongdoing occurred." Though Jackson's words were strong and persuasive, Nina couldn't help but notice the stiffness in his delivery. She observed that his voice occasionally stumbled, as if his mind was still distracted by the earlier encounter. Jackson tried to maintain his calm exterior, but every time he glanced over at Nina, his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Nina sat at the opposite table, listening carefully to Jackson's statement without showing any reaction. She kept her face composed and professional, knowing that Jackson was slowly losing the control he prided himself on. His arguments were nothing new. They were standard defenses that Nina had thoroughly prepared to counter. When Jackson finished his opening statement, he returned to his seat with a quick glance toward Nina, as though waiting for her response. But Nina remained unfazed. She merely glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips, letting Jackson know that she was more than ready. Now it was Nina's turn to stand. She walked with a confident stride, her footsteps echoing in the silent room. Standing before the jury, she took a deep breath and began her presentation, her voice clear and strong. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she started, her eyes moving from one juror to another. "My client has endured prolonged injustice. Not only do we have clear evidence, but we also have the truth on our side. Today we will show you that the damages my client has suffered are the result of the negligence and irresponsibility of the opposing party." Nina's voice carried no arrogance or urgency. Each word she spoke had weight, and her calm confidence commanded the attention of the entire courtroom. She didn't need to be overly dramatic or rely on clever tactics. The clarity and logic in her arguments were enough to draw everyone in. As Nina presented her case, Jackson sat at the opposing table, trying to maintain his composure. But Nina could see the tension in the way he flipped through his papers, how his hand gripped his pen tightly, and how he kept glancing over his notes. It seemed that Jackson was searching for something to support his case, but he couldn't find anything strong enough to counter Nina's sharp arguments. Nina continued to dismantle each of Jackson's points, steadily and convincingly. Every time she delivered a counter-argument, she could feel the atmosphere in the courtroom shifting in her favor. She had spent weeks researching and preparing for this case, and now all of that effort was paying off. Jackson sat across from her, clearly affected by Nina's confident demeanor. Although he tried to hide it, Nina noticed the signs of anxiety in his movements. Jackson was no longer the arrogant lawyer she had met in the parking lot. Before her was a man who was gradually losing control in a confrontation he had once thought he would easily win. As Nina wrapped up her presentation, the room fell silent. There was no need for grandiose words or excessive emphasis. Nina had done exactly what she needed to do, present a strong, clear case. She returned to her seat, feeling the shift in the room's energy. She had successfully thrown Jackson off balance right from the start. Looking across the room, Nina saw Jackson trying to regain his composure, but every time their eyes met, he quickly looked away. The smugness was gone, replaced by a look of worry, and Nina knew that the legal battle was far from over, but the advantage was now hers. The trial continued with cross-examinations and presentations from both sides. Jackson, despite his efforts to regain his professional demeanor, couldn't hide his tension. During witness questioning, he began to stumble, asking incoherent questions and sometimes contradicting his own points from his opening statement. Each time Jackson stood to speak, his voice lacked the steadiness it once had. Instead, it was rushed, as if he wanted to finish quickly to avoid a complete defeat. In contrast, Nina remained calm, her every move purposeful, her every question sharp and to the point. Not only did she successfully counter Jackson's arguments, but she also gradually built a complete narrative that persuaded the jury that her client had indeed suffered clear injustices. There was a particularly memorable moment when Nina stood up to cross-examine a key witness from the opposing side. The witness had initially seemed confident, but with each of Nina's sharp questions, the truth began to emerge. The witness grew flustered, hesitant, and ultimately, their testimony completely fell apart, becoming a major win for Nina's side. The jury watched closely, and from their expressions, Nina could tell that they were leaning in her favor. Jackson, at this point, could no longer hide his frustration and helplessness. He was no longer the confident lawyer he had been at the start of the trial. Instead, he was impatient and anxious. Every time Nina made a new argument, Jackson became more flustered, trying to counter her points but finding that his rebuttals were increasingly weak and disjointed. Even the judge noticed, frequently reminding Jackson to stay calm and follow proper procedure. Nina maintained her focus, knowing that all the hard work she had put in over the past few weeks was paying off. She not only had a firm grasp of the case, but she also understood each of her opponent's weaknesses, every place where Jackson might stumble. She seized every opportunity to strike gently but decisively, pushing Jackson further into a defensive position. Finally, after a series of rebuttals and closing arguments, the trial drew to a close. Both Nina and Jackson stood to deliver their final statements. Jackson tried to reclaim a bit of his former confidence, but it was clear that his anxiety still showed on his face. Though his words were strong, they lacked the necessary conviction. The jury had seen his nervousness and lack of preparation throughout the trial. When it was Nina's turn, she stood confidently, her eyes directed toward the jury. She began with a calm, deliberate tone, each word carrying strength. Her argument was clear and concise, painting a vivid picture of the injustices her client had suffered. There was no room for doubt. The evidence was clear, and Nina delivered a closing argument that completely weakened Jackson's position. As she finished her closing statement, the jury listened attentively. The judge nodded in agreement, and Nina felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had done everything within her power, and now the outcome was in the hands of the jury. After the jury left the room to deliberate, the entire courtroom fell into a hushed anticipation. Nina sat quietly, her hands still clutching her briefcase, but inside she knew she had done her best. Jackson sat across from her, his gaze unfocused, no longer confident. He knew that his chances of winning had slipped away. Hours later, the jury returned with their final verdict. When the judge announced the decision in favor of Nina's client, the room lit up with the feeling of victory. Nina took a deep breath, satisfied that she had fought for justice with everything she had. Across the room, Jackson sat motionless, devoid of his arrogance or self-assurance. He had lost, and lost completely. Nina slowly gathered her documents, not needing to show any outward signs of triumph. She knew that the battle was over and that she was the winner, not just in the trial, but in the confrontation with Jackson's prejudice and arrogance. While Nina remained composed, Jackson couldn't hide the disappointment etched on his face. He rose from the lawyer's table, dejected, while his colleagues were at a loss for words to comfort him. Jackson's client, a powerful executive, sat behind him, his face darkened by the unfavorable verdict. There was no need for many words. Jackson knew he would face immediate consequences. As soon as the trial ended, Nina left the courtroom with a professional demeanor, revealing nothing but a quiet sense of satisfaction. But on the other side, Jackson was stopped by his client right in the courtroom. His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp and full of anger. "What the hell just happened?" Jackson's client growled. "You told me this case was a guaranteed win." Jackson stammered, trying to explain but struggling to find the right words. I prepared thoroughly, but Nina Johnson, she was too good at persuading the jury. I didn't expect—" "What? You're blaming your opponent for why you lost?" His client cut him off, the fury in his voice growing clearer. "You promised me a different result. You're the top lawyer at this firm, and I can't believe you lost a case as easy as this." Jackson tried to calm himself, but he couldn't hide his unease. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, and his voice grew weaker. "I'll appeal. We still have a chance." But the client simply raised an eyebrow, his tone colder than ever. "No, Jackson. There's no more chance. I'm pulling all my contracts with your firm. Don't expect a dime from me again." With that, the client turned and stormed out, leaving Jackson standing there stunned and helpless, his eyes fixed on the ground, unsure of what to do next. For a lawyer like Jackson, losing a major client wasn't just a financial blow, it was a serious threat to his reputation. And now everything he had once prided himself on, his confidence, his reputation, his success, seemed to crumble in the wake of one courtroom defeat. Jackson staggered out of the courtroom, the weight of failure bearing down on his shoulders. He passed by Nina, who was standing in the hallway, speaking with her client, their eyes briefly meeting. But this time, there was no challenging or smug look in his eyes. Instead, they were filled with bitterness and defeat. He knew that his arrogance had led him to this moment. A few days later, news of Jackson losing his major client spread throughout the legal community. His colleagues began whispering about his embarrassing defeat in court. Other clients started pulling away from him, fearing that he was no longer capable of maintaining his once impressive performance. The firm where Jackson worked began to feel the pressure of keeping him on board, and his partners were considering his future with the company. Jackson tried to regain control, but the harder he tried, the more he failed. He began losing focus in other cases, making small but costly mistakes. The sense of defeat and the lingering shadow of his failure against Nina seemed to haunt him at every moment, preventing him from returning to the confident and sharp lawyer he had once been. Meanwhile, Nina continued with her work. She received praise from her client and colleagues, and her career only grew stronger. She no longer thought about Jackson. He was now just a part of her past, a lesson she had overcome. But for Jackson, the consequences of that failure weren't just about losing one trial. They were the collapse of the entire career and reputation he had built. A few weeks after the trial, Nina found herself back in court for another case. She stepped out of the courthouse in the late afternoon, feeling relieved after a productive day. Although today's case wasn't as intense as her showdown with Jackson, Nina was always careful and thoroughly prepared for any situation. As she made her way to the parking lot, the setting sun cast a warm golden glow. When she neared her sedan, Nina unexpectedly noticed a familiar figure leaning against the sleek black SUV parked near her car. It was Jackson Ford. A sense of caution rose within her. He didn't look as arrogant as before. Instead, there was tension in his eyes and posture. Jackson stood there, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on her with a dark, angry expression. Nina sighed, not wanting to escalate any further conflict with Jackson, but it was clear he had been waiting for her. She unlocked her car and walked toward it, maintaining her usual calm. "So you think it's over, huh?" Jackson's voice cut through the air, sharp and cold. Nina stopped, turning to face Jackson. She kept her tone calm, not wanting to escalate the situation. "Jackson, the case is over. I did my job. There's nothing more to discuss." But Jackson didn't back down. He stepped closer, his eyes burning with barely restrained fury. "You destroyed everything I had. You didn't just win the trial, you cost me my biggest contract, and now my career's going down the drain. You don't think there's going to be consequences for that?" Nina looked directly at Jackson, sensing the anger boiling within him. She knew that it wasn't just her that had led to Jackson's downfall. It was his arrogance and lack of preparation that had put him in this position. But she also understood that at this moment, Jackson couldn't see things objectively. "Jackson," she began, her voice still calm, "you lost because you weren't prepared, not because of me. That case had nothing to do with your personal life. You misjudged the situation, and that's the consequence. Don't blame others for your mistakes." But Jackson wasn't listening. He took another step closer, his eyes flashing with rage. "You don't understand. You've been setting me up from the beginning. Since that parking lot, you've been trying to throw me off." Nina sighed, feeling exhausted by the baseless accusations. "I had no intention of doing that, Jackson. I was just doing my job." Suddenly, Jackson lost control. In his anger, he grabbed Nina by the shoulders, shoving her back toward the car. "You think you're better than me? You think you can take everything from me and not pay the price?" Nina felt a sharp pain as her back hit the car door. She was shocked that Jackson had resorted to violence. "Jackson, stop," she said, her voice firm and commanding. "You're going too far." At that moment, the sound of a police car's siren blared in the distance. 2 police cars appeared at the edge of the parking lot, their blue and red lights flashing, making the scene even more tense. An officer stepped out of the car, his voice loud and authoritative. "Take your hands off her now." Jackson startled, releasing Nina and stepping back a few paces, his face filled with confusion. The officer quickly approached, his hand resting on his belt, ready to act if Jackson didn't comply. "What do you think you're doing?" the officer asked sternly. Jackson tried to explain, but his voice was shaky. She ruined my career." The officer didn't let him continue. "You just assaulted her. This is violence and it's unacceptable. You're coming with us now." Jackson looked at Nina one last time, his eyes filled with disappointment and rage, but this time it seemed he realized that he had gone too far. The officer handcuffed Jackson and led him toward the police car. Before being taken away, Jackson shouted bitterly, "You'll pay for this, Nina. This isn't over." Nina stood there watching as Jackson was led away. Her heart was racing, but she knew she had done the right thing by staying calm and not allowing the situation to escalate. The police asked her if she wanted to file additional charges, but Nina simply nodded, thanking them for stepping in when they did. She took a deep breath and then turned back to her car. This time, Nina knew she couldn't stay silent anymore. Jackson had crossed a line, and unless stronger actions were taken, this wouldn't end here. After the tense incident in the parking lot, Nina spent a lot of time thinking about her next move. Initially, she had considered letting it go, thinking Jackson was just acting out of anger and hurt after his major defeat. But every time she recalled the crazed look in Jackson's eyes, the contempt and violence in his actions, she realized that staying silent would only make things worse. Jackson had crossed the line, and she couldn't allow this to continue. After careful consideration, Nina decided that she had to take legal action. She couldn't stand by and allow someone, especially someone who had publicly insulted and attacked her, to go unpunished. Jackson's assault wasn't just an outburst of anger. It was a blatant disregard for the law and basic respect between people. Nina understood that she needed to act not only to protect herself, but also to send a clear message that violence, for any reason, would never be tolerated. A few days after the incident, Nina went to the police station with a firm decision. She would file charges against Jackson for assault. Walking into the station, she felt the cold, tense atmosphere. She was used to legal situations in court, but this time she wasn't the attorney defending someone else. She was the victim, seeking justice. That feeling gave her a moment of hesitation, but her resolve didn't waver. Nina knew that this wasn't just about protecting herself. It was about standing up for the values she believed in. A young officer greeted her at the front desk. After asking why she was there, the officer invited her to sit at a small table to give a detailed statement. Nina's heart beat faster as she began to recount the events from start to finish, from the initial encounter in the parking lot to the assault that had just taken place. Each time she recalled the details, Nina realized more clearly that she was doing the right thing. Jackson had gone too far. "Do you believe that Mr. Jackson Ford's actions were premeditated?" the officer asked, after taking notes on what Nina had said. Nina paused for a moment, trying to remember every detail of the confrontation. "I think he acted out of uncontrollable anger," she said slowly. "But I also feel that his anger had been building for a while, ever since he lost the case and his career was threatened. When he saw me again, he couldn't control it anymore." The officer nodded, taking notes before continuing with a few more questions to clarify the situation. "Do you want to formally press charges against him? We can start the investigation process if you agree." Nina took a deep breath, weighing the gravity of the decision she was about to make. She knew that filing charges against a colleague, especially one with a reputation like Jackson's, wouldn't be easy. But she also understood that her silence would only allow Jackson to continue his behavior, potentially putting others in similar situations. With that thought in mind, she nodded firmly. "Yes, I want to press charges. Jackson Ford needs to be held accountable for his actions." The officer thanked her and completed Nina's statement file, explaining the legal process that would follow once she officially filed the charges. Afterward, Nina was invited to sign the official paperwork. She picked up the pen and signed her name with a feeling of both relief and determination. She knew that this wasn't just about protecting herself, but about facing what had happened so that she would never feel powerless in the face of threats again. Once all the paperwork was done, the officer stood up and shook Nina's hand. "We'll notify Mr. Ford and begin the investigation. If we need any additional information, we'll contact you." Nina thanked the officer and left the station with a much lighter heart than when she had entered. She sat in her car for a moment, closing her eyes and taking a deep breath. A sense of relief began to wash over her as she realized that she had taken the right action. Facing Jackson wasn't easy, but she couldn't allow his anger and violence to threaten her life. This step wasn't just a legal action, it was a way of reclaiming her rights and her safety. In the following days, Nina continued her work as usual. She focused on new cases and challenges in her career, refusing to let Jackson's actions interfere with her life any longer. However, deep down, she knew that this was only the beginning of a long legal process. Jackson would have to face the legal consequences of his behavior, and Nina knew she had made the right decision. She had no regrets about her choice to press charges against Jackson. Although it might put him in a difficult position, that was the responsibility everyone had to bear for their own actions. Jackson had been given the chance to change after his defeat, but instead of learning from it, he had chosen the path of blame and violence. Nina wasn't going to let that happen again. With her calm determination, she was ready to face whatever came next. A few weeks passed since Nina had officially filed charges against Jackson, and her life gradually returned to normal. She continued her work with intense focus, as if the situation with Jackson hadn't affected her. But deep inside, Nina knew that the legal process was underway, and its outcome would have a significant impact on Jackson's life. Meanwhile, Jackson Ford's career continued to spiral downward. After losing the trial and the parking lot incident, his reputation had been severely damaged. Rumors spread quickly within the legal community about how Jackson had lost control, not just in the courtroom but in real life as well. His former clients began questioning his professional ability, and the law firm where Jackson worked became increasingly impatient with him. One day, while Nina was sitting in her office working, her phone buzzed with a message from a colleague in the legal field. "Did you hear the news? Jackson Ford got fired." Reading the short message, Nina wasn't surprised, but she didn't feel any satisfaction either. It seemed like the inevitable conclusion to a series of events Jackson had brought upon himself. After Jackson was sued for assault, his career went into turmoil. Not only had he lost a major case, but Jackson also had to deal with the charges Nina had filed against him. The matter became public, and there was no way for him to hide his actions from his partners and clients. Jackson, once the star of the firm, was now a name of ridicule among lawyers. The news of Jackson's firing quickly spread within the legal community. His law firm, once highly respected, had no choice but to let him go to protect its reputation. After a series of tense meetings among the partners, they decided that keeping Jackson on would only further damage the firm's credibility. For Jackson, being fired was a huge blow. He had once been a successful lawyer with a career full of potential and opportunity, but now everything had fallen apart because of his arrogance and lack of self-control. Jackson had not only lost his job, but also the pride and honor he had spent years building. After hearing the news of Jackson's firing, Nina reflected on everything that had happened. While she knew that Jackson was responsible for his actions, she didn't feel triumphant or pleased. Nina had never wanted Jackson's life to end up this way. She had simply wanted to protect herself and prevent anyone from using their anger to tear her down. And now Jackson was facing the consequences of his arrogance and lack of discipline. That afternoon, as Nina left her office, she felt as though a chapter in her life had closed. Jackson, the man who had confronted her with all his arrogance and envy, was no longer a concern of hers. She knew that life would go on, and she would move forward, leaving behind the storms Jackson had created. Nina didn't feel joy at the news of Jackson losing his job, but she understood that it was an unavoidable consequence when someone failed to control their behavior. In a competitive field like law, mistakes like Jackson's would never be forgiven, especially when they were repeated and caused damage to the firm's reputation. As Jackson left his law firm, his steps were heavy, as if each step carried the weight of failure. No longer the respected lawyer he once was, Jackson had become a man whose career and reputation had crumbled under the pressure of his own arrogance and recklessness. He no longer had a job, a reputation, or even the self-respect that had once made him feel superior to everyone around him. Meanwhile, Nina continued to move forward, her career advancing and her determination stronger than ever. She had proven that calmness and resilience would always help her overcome any challenge. More than just winning a trial, she had won over herself, overcoming negative emotions and standing firm in the face of injustice and violence. Jackson may have lost everything, but Nina knew that her career and life were moving forward, stronger and more secure than ever. A few weeks after Nina's lawsuit was officially filed, the court issued its final ruling. With ample evidence from witness testimony, security camera footage, and most importantly, the undeniable truth of Jackson Ford's violent actions, the court found Jackson guilty of assault. He was fined a substantial amount and given a permanent restraining order from approaching Nina. With this decision, Nina felt a tremendous weight lifted from her shoulders. Justice had been served, and she could finally rest assured that Jackson would no longer have any chance to harm her. Although the outcome of the lawsuit brought Nina relief, she didn't feel triumphant or gloating. Throughout the legal process, Nina had faced a range of emotions, from anger, anxiety to insecurity. But in the end, she had learned how to face greater challenges and had emerged stronger. For Nina, this wasn't just a legal battle. It was also a mental one, and now she could proudly say that she had won. However, for Jackson, life after the ruling had become a nightmare from which he couldn't escape. His career had completely collapsed. The law firm where he had once been a valued and respected attorney had no choice but to fire him to protect its own reputation. Jackson, once a rising star in the legal world, had become an outcast, not only in the eyes of his firm but also in the legal community where he had once dedicated so many years. News of the lawsuit quickly spread throughout the legal world. For those who had once known Jackson Ford, a lawyer famous for his confidence and skill, hearing that he had been fired and embroiled in an assault lawsuit became a topic of discussion. Those who had worked with Jackson were shocked to see someone like him fall into such a situation. His former colleagues gradually distanced themselves, not wanting to associate their names with a failed and problematic lawyer. Friends who once seemed close also began to drift away, realizing that Jackson was now just a shadow of his former self. Every door that Jackson had once had open was now slammed shut. No law firm wanted to hire someone who had lost all credibility and had a criminal record for assault, and certainly not someone notorious for arrogance and violence. Jackson tried to find new work, but every attempt was futile. He went from law firm to law firm, but only received rejection after rejection. Other lawyers, though they might have had sympathy, couldn't risk their own reputations by associating with someone like Jackson. Each day that passed, he sank deeper into frustration, bitterness, and isolation. Nina, from a distance, only heard news about Jackson through colleagues and acquaintances in the industry. Once she received a message from a friend saying that Jackson had left the city. It seemed that he had chosen to run away, finding somewhere far away to start over, but no one knew for sure. Nina simply remained silent upon hearing the news, not feeling any satisfaction or joy. For her, Jackson was part of the past, a chapter that had closed. She no longer harbored any feelings of resentment or anger because she knew she had done what was necessary to protect herself and seek justice. Nina's life after the lawsuit continued on a positive trajectory. Her career began to flourish more than ever. Her reputation within the legal community continued to grow, thanks to her success in major cases, and notably, her steadfastness in defending her own rights. She was admired by many clients and colleagues for her professionalism and firmness in difficult situations. The lawsuit with Jackson, though not something she had wanted, became a turning point in her career, helping her build credibility and establish her name in the field. One afternoon, Nina sat in her office looking out the window at the clear blue sky. The gentle rays of sunlight streaming through the glass gave her a sense of peace. She reflected on the entire journey she had been through, from the first encounter with Jackson to the final resolution of the lawsuit. This legal battle hadn't just helped her find justice, it had also helped her grow, become stronger. She had learned how to face fear and injustice, and most importantly, she had overcome them with patience and perseverance. Jackson Ford, once a formidable name in the legal world, was now only a memory in her life. He had destroyed everything he had, not just because of professional mistakes, but because of his arrogance and lack of self-control. But for Nina, none of that mattered anymore. She had overcome that difficult phase and was moving forward with more confidence and determination than ever. Looking back at everything, Nina didn't feel anger toward Jackson. She realized that he had driven himself down a dark path, but that was no longer her concern. She had done her duty, both legally and personally. She knew that she had not only protected her own rights, but had also sent a clear message: no one had the right to insult or harm others without facing consequences. With a light smile, Nina turned off her computer, gathered her papers and prepared to leave her office. The sky outside was beautiful, the sunlight inviting her to step out and enjoy life. Nina knew that she had emerged stronger after all the challenges, and she was ready to face whatever the future might bring. She had weathered every storm and would continue to move forward, stronger than ever. Jackson Ford may have lost everything, but Nina Johnson was the true winner, not just in the courtroom but in her own life. The story of Nina Johnson is not just about winning a trial, but also a testament to the power of perseverance, courage, and an unyielding spirit in the face of injustice. Throughout her journey, Nina showed that justice belongs to those who stand up for themselves and are willing to confront challenges, no matter how difficult. She overcame prejudice and pressure to regain balance in her life, and from that, she grew stronger and wiser. This story reminds us of the importance of always fighting for what is right and never allowing fear or the pressure from others to dictate our lives. Every battle in life teaches us valuable lessons, helping us become more resilient and ready to face the challenges ahead. If you find Nina's story inspiring and meaningful, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss more meaningful stories and life lessons. Together, we'll continue to explore more positive messages and gain strength for each person's journey.